So picture this. It's 5.18 on a Sunday morning. You're comfy in bed, maybe thinking about coffee already, and then bam, earthquake. Anyone else feel that one yesterday in Wellington? I know I did. And it seems like we weren't the only ones, right? Hawke's Bay, you guys got hit later that night too. So what's going on with all this shaking in New Zealand lately? Well, you know we love a good deep dive, and today's no exception. We're going to be looking into those October 6th earthquakes, especially the ones that hit Wellington and Hawke's Bay, and we're using a recent article from One News to help us out. They talked to GNS Science as Senior Seismic Advisor Jonathan Hanson to get his expert opinion, and let me tell you, some of this stuff is seriously interesting. Before we get into all the details about subduction zones and tectonic plates, all that fun stuff, let's do a quick recap of what happened, shall we? First, we had that magnitude 5.7 earthquake near Wellington, about 25 kilometers west to be exact, and it hit at a depth of 30 kilometers. Then later that night, boom, Hawke's Bay gets hit with a strong quake near Porongahau. This one was shallower, just 16 kilometers deep.
Now, here's the part that I found really interesting in the article. Hanson says that these two earthquakes were most likely not connected. And that really got me thinking. Two big earthquakes, same island, same day, but totally separate things happening. It's almost like the Earth decided to have a 2-for-1 earthquake special. So I'm really curious to hear what our expert has to say about why these two earthquakes seem so disconnected.
It all comes down to location, location, location. Even though both quakes happened pretty close to each other time-wise, if you look at the differences in their locations and depths, it tells us that they came from different fault ruptures. It's kind of like having two different pressure points that release at basically the same time, but they don't actually cause each other.
So even though they were close together in time, they were actually totally separate events. That's pretty amazing.
Exactly. That Wellington quake at 30 kilometers deep is what we call moderate to shallow, which means it happened within the Earth's crust. The Hawke's Bay quake, since it was shallower at 16 kilometers, suggests that the rupture happened closer to the surface. These little details, along with how far apart the epicenters were, are really important in understanding why scientists believe they weren't directly related.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about all the smaller tremors people have been feeling, especially in Hawke's Day? It must feel like the ground is never going to stop shaking. Is that just a normal day in Hawke's Bay, or is there something else causing all these smaller quakes to happen more often?
You're telling me it'd be like trying to sleep on a waterbed, right? But those smaller quakes, we often call them swarms, those are actually pretty normal for Hawke's Bay. And that's where things get really interesting. Remember us talking about tectonic plates?
Yeah, like a really, really slow car crash happening off the coast, right?
Exactly. That's our subduction zone, where the Pacific plate, the oceanic one, is sliding under the Australian plate. Now, try to imagine the pressure that builds up from these two massive, huge slabs of rock just grinding up against each other. It's kind of like when you try to squeeze a tube of toothpaste with the cap still on.
Okay, I can already feel the pressure building. So all that pressure, it's got to go somewhere, right?
You got it. Sometimes it bursts out suddenly and boom, you've got yourself a big, scary earthquake. But sometimes it's more like a slow leak, right? That, my friend, is where those slow slip events come into play.
Slow slip events. Okay, those sound a little sneaky.
They are. They're totally different from the sudden jolt of an earthquake. These events happen gradually. Sometimes they can even last for weeks or even months. It's more like a slow creep, releasing energy bit by bit instead of all at once. Imagine the Earth letting out a long, slow sigh instead of a big shout.
I don't know why, but that actually makes me feel a little better knowing that pressure is being released, even if it's slow. But I have a feeling you're about to hit me with a but, aren't you?
Well, yeah, there's always a catch, right? So the good news is, scientists think that these slow slip events actually make those really massive earthquakes a bit less likely, at least in the long run. Think of them as pressure valves. They're stopping things from getting too out of control, but...
There it is, the but.
Right, even though they might be preventing a megaquake, those slow slip events, they can sometimes set off the smaller, more frequent earthquakes, those swarms we were talking about, the kind that might make you feel like you're living in Hawke's Bay on a trampoline. It's all about finding a balance, I guess.
So more smaller shakes, less chance of a huge one. That's yeah, that's a lot to think about. It does make me wonder, though, all this pressure, all this release, does it mean that these small earthquakes are a sign that a big one is on the way? Is that the big question everyone's asking? It's the question that always pops into my mind after we have a few good shakes, Yes, especially living in New Zealand, you start to wonder, are these smaller ones just a warning? Like the Earth is getting ready to really let loose?
Totally. I get it. It's natural to think that way. And honestly, it's not impossible for a larger earthquake to happen after a bunch of smaller ones. But here's the thing that's good to keep in mind. The most common thing that happens after a bigger quake is what we call aftershocks. Basically, these are just smaller tremors that, over time, start to fade away, kind of like the Earth is taking a deep breath and settling back down.
Okay, phew. That does make me feel a bit better. But I gotta ask, with all this talk about, unpredictable ground movements and everything, what are we actually supposed to do if we feel another earthquake? Just asking for a friend who might still be a little shaky from that 5 a.m. wake-up call the other day.
You already know this, but it's super important. Drop, cover, and hold. I know, it sounds almost too easy, but trust me, it works. And here's something I found really interesting in that article. They said that advice is true no matter where you are. Even if you're, say, in the shower, or, well, you get the idea. If you try to move around during those first few seconds, it can actually be more dangerous.
Gotcha. So basically, earthquake happens, become a human earthquake burrito as fast as possible, no matter what.
Exactly. You got it. And for anyone listening who lives close to the coast, those tsunami zones, it's really important to know those evacuation routes and what to do if a big one hits. Really important.
Couldn't agree more. It's wild. We can't really predict exactly when or where the next earthquake's going to happen, but just knowing about the science behind it all, like we did today, makes me feel a bit more prepared, But less like every time the ground shakes, it's a total surprise.
For sure. Knowing what's going on is always better, especially with these big natural events. Earthquakes are definitely a force to be reckoned with.
Absolutely. So here's something to think about as we wrap up today. Imagine you were creating an early warning system for earthquakes. What would it be like? What kind of sound or signal would grab everyone's attention in those few seconds before the shaking starts? It's something to think about. That's all the time we have for today. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe, everyone.